She is sitting at her kitchen table with a folder in front of her. Property deed, paid in full. Retirement account, 6 figures deep. And when her coworker asks her, casually over coffee, how she is managing on her salary, she says something like, "Oh, I am just getting by, paycheck to paycheck like everybody else." She is lying. Not out of shame. Out of strategy. And that right there is the part nobody wants to admit. Somewhere along the way, a lot of women quietly learned that the safest thing to do with money is to act like you do not have any. Not spend like you do not have it. Act like it. There is a difference. And that difference is the entire subject of this conversation, because the moment a woman stops talking about her money out loud, something in her starts operating differently. Her decisions change. Her confidence changes. Even the way she negotiates, saves, and protects herself changes. Silence is not empty. Silence does something. So let us talk about what actually happens in the space where the money conversation used to be. Here is the belief almost everyone walks around with. People assume that women who are financially comfortable talk about it more. More confidence, more openness, more of that effortless energy you see online where someone is casually mentioning their portfolio like it is the weather. But if you actually look closely at women who are financially secure, quietly wealthy, sitting on paid-off property and steady investments, you will notice something almost backwards. The more financially secure a woman becomes, the less she says about it. Not because she is hiding something shameful, because she has learned something uncomfortable about what happens when people know. That is the hidden truth. Financial silence is not a symptom of struggling. For a lot of women, it is a symptom of arrival. And once you see that pattern, you cannot unsee it. Let's break down why this happens, because the reasons are less about spreadsheets and far more about human behavior. First, there is the assumption tax. The second people find out a woman has money, the assumptions start rolling in immediately. She must have married into it. She must have gotten lucky. She must be exaggerating. Somebody handed it to her. Rarely, and I mean rarely, does the assumption default to she built this through discipline and smart decisions. So a woman who has actually done the work often finds herself in this strange position where telling the truth about her success gets her less credit, not more. The math does not add up in her favor, so she stops doing the math out loud. Think about how quickly that assumption gets attached. A man mentions a good year, and the room nods along, impressed, maybe even a little competitive. A woman mentions the same thing, and the room starts quietly building a backstory for her, usually one that has nothing to do with her actual effort. That gap is not imagined. It is measurable in how people respond, and women feel it long before anyone says it out loud. So the silence becomes a shortcut. Skip the explanation, skip the doubt, skip the exhausting job of proving a success that should not require proof in the first place. Second, there is the negotiation cost. Money talk is currency in itself. If a woman is open about her financial position, that information travels. It shows up in salary negotiations where a manager suddenly feels less urgency to offer more because, well, she seems fine. It shows up in business deals where a partner senses she has less pressure to say yes quickly. Silence in these moments is not secrecy for the sake of secrecy. It is leverage. A woman who keeps her financial cards close to her chest is a woman who negotiates from a position of mystery instead of a position of exposure. And mystery, whether we like to admit it or not, holds power that full transparency does not. There is also a quieter version of this cost that shows up outside of formal negotiations, in the everyday moments nobody thinks to name. The moment a coworker learns she does not need the overtime, the offers of overtime dry up. The moment a client senses she is not desperate for the contract, the client suddenly finds more respect for her rate. Desperation, real or performed, changes how people treat you, and a lot of women figured out early that appearing slightly stretched keeps people gentler, more accommodating, less likely to push. It is a strange kind of power that only works if nobody can see behind the curtain. Third, there is the social recalibration. The moment people learn a woman has real money, the entire dynamic of a room shifts. She becomes the one people quietly compare themselves to. She becomes the one people expect to pay for things. She becomes the subject of conversations she is not even present for. Nobody warns you about this part. Nobody tells you that financial success comes with an invisible tax of being watched differently. So a lot of women make a calculated decision, sometimes without even realizing they're making it, to keep the number invisible so the relationships around them stay unchanged. Now let's talk about what the performance actually looks like in practice, because it is more sophisticated than people assume. It is rarely a dramatic lie. It is small, constant editing. It is wearing the older coat on purpose. It is letting a comment about tight budgets go uncorrected. It is choosing the cheaper option in front of an audience even when the expensive one was never going to be a stretch. None of these are lies exactly. They are omissions, and omissions are easier to live with because they do not feel like dishonesty. They feel like modesty. But modesty and strategy can look identical from the outside while functioning completely differently on the inside, and the woman doing it usually knows the difference even when nobody else does. What makes this performance so sustainable is that it rarely gets questioned. Nobody challenges a woman for claiming to have less than she does. Society has spent so long expecting women to minimize, to defer, to take up less space, that acting broke fits neatly into an existing script everyone already recognizes. Acting wealthy would draw scrutiny. Acting broke draws nothing at all. It is the path of least resistance, which is exactly why so many financially secure women default to it without ever consciously deciding to. Now here is where it gets interesting because staying quiet about money was never supposed to be permanent. It was supposed to be protective. But protection, when it goes on long enough, starts to reshape the person doing the protecting. Think about what it does to someone to spend years underreporting their own success. To constantly downplay, minimize, deflect. Over time, the outside performance starts leaking into the inside belief system. A woman who has spent 5 years saying "I am just getting by" starts to internalize a version of herself that genuinely feels less secure than she actually is. She built the wealth, but she never built the identity that matches it. The bank account grew. The self-concept did not. This is the part that gets skipped over constantly. People assume the biggest challenge in building wealth is earning it. It is not. The real challenge is updating your own internal script fast enough to actually believe it is yours, is safe, is deserved, and is allowed to be discussed without apology. There is a specific kind of disorientation that comes with this gap. It shows up in small, almost comedic ways. A woman who can comfortably cover an emergency still feels her stomach drop when a bill arrives because her nervous system was trained on a different number than the one currently sitting in her account. She still reaches for the sale rack out of instinct, not necessity. She still hesitates before booking something nice, running an old calculation in her head that no longer applies to her actual life. The money moved faster than the identity did, and until the identity catches up, she is technically wealthy while still functioning like she is one bad month away from disaster. That gap is not a personal failure. It is a predictable outcome of years spent practicing smallness in public. You cannot rehearse scarcity for a decade and expect abundance to feel natural the moment the numbers change. The performance becomes muscle memory, and muscle memory does not update itself just because a bank statement did. If you have ever felt like you have more than you let on but still catch yourself talking small about money, saying things like, "Oh, it is nothing," or "I got lucky," or "I am not doing that well," really, pause on that for a second. That habit of shrinking your own financial story did not come from nowhere. It came from somewhere that taught you visibility was risky. If this kind of pattern recognition is interesting to you, the psychology behind the things women do quietly with money, and why, consider subscribing. This channel exists to name the patterns nobody puts into words. Let's go further because there is a twist here that most people never clock. You would think the solution is obvious.
Just talk about it.
Be transparent. Normalize the conversation. Problem solved. Except here is what nobody tells you. When some women finally do start talking openly about their financial position after years of silence, they discover something unexpected. The relief they were expecting does not always show up right away. Instead, there is a strange period of exposure anxiety. Suddenly people treat her differently, exactly the way she predicted they would, and instead of feeling powerful, she feels watched. The thing she avoided for years happens exactly as feared, and for a moment it seems like the silence was the smarter choice after all. But here is where the real transformation happens, and it is the part of this story worth sitting with. The discomfort of being seen financially is not proof that silence was correct. It is proof that visibility takes practice, the same way any skill takes practice. Nobody is naturally comfortable being financially visible in a world that has spent decades teaching women that discussing money is either bragging or oversharing. That discomfort fades the more it is exercised, not the more it is avoided. The women who eventually get comfortable being financially visible do not get there by accident. They get there by doing it small first. Sharing a number with one trusted person before sharing it with a room. Naming a salary in a private conversation before naming it publicly. Correcting one assumption out loud instead of letting it slide. Visibility, like anything else, is built in reps. It also helps to notice what actually happens when the fear plays out versus what the mind predicted would happen. Most women brace for a dramatic reaction, judgment, jealousy, a shift in how they are treated. What usually happens instead is far quieter. A flicker of surprise. A brief recalibration. Then life continues almost exactly as it did before, except now there is one less thing being managed behind the scenes. The catastrophe the mind rehearses rarely matches the mild, forgettable reality, and once a woman collects enough evidence of that gap, the fear starts losing its grip. And this is where the deeper stakes start to show up, because this is not really about money at all. This is about ownership. A woman who cannot talk about her financial reality cannot fully own her financial reality. There is a version of wealth that exists only on paper, and a version that exists in how a person carries themselves, negotiates, makes decisions, and shows up in rooms. The paper version can grow in total silence. The lived version requires language. It requires being able to say the actual number, the actual plan, the actual position, without shrinking it for someone else's comfort. Here is something worth sitting with. Silence was never really about protecting the money. It was about protecting the relationships around the money. And that trade quietly costs more than people realize, because the relationships that only survive on financial ignorance were never as solid as they appeared. A friendship, a partnership, a professional relationship that depends on one person staying smaller than they actually are is not stability. It is an arrangement built on incomplete information, and arrangements like that tend to crack the moment the truth eventually comes out, because it usually does. So what actually shifts the moment a woman decides to stop performing broke and start speaking plainly about her financial reality? The first shift is in how she negotiates. A woman who can say her number out loud, calmly, without flinching, walks into every negotiation with a completely different posture. She is not managing perception anymore. She is stating fact. That single shift changes salary conversations, business deals, and every future opportunity where money is on the table. The second shift is in how she filters people. The moment financial silence ends, so does the guessing game about who actually respects her and who is only comfortable around a smaller, quieter version of her success. That filtering process is uncomfortable in the short term and incredibly clarifying in the long term. The third shift, and this one is the quiet bomb of the entire conversation, is in how she makes decisions about her own future. A woman who is honest with herself and others about her financial position stops making decisions based on managing appearances and starts making decisions based on actual strategy. She stops keeping money sitting stagnant because moving it would require explaining it. She stops avoiding investment conversations because they would reveal too much. She stops playing defense with her own resources. This shows up in very specific, very unglamorous ways. It looks like actually asking someone knowledgeable a real question about where money should be sitting, instead of nodding along in a conversation she has quietly opted out of for years. It looks like moving funds out of an account earning almost nothing because she is no longer worried that a fatter balance sheet will invite questions she does not want to answer. It looks like signing up for something, a course, a certification, an opportunity, without first calculating whether the cost will look reckless to someone watching. Every one of these choices was always technically available to her. What changed was not the option. What changed was her willingness to act on it in the open. This is the piece almost nobody talks about. Financial silence does not just protect a woman from other people's opinions. It quietly limits her own growth because growth requires feedback, mentorship, comparison, conversation, and none of that is available to someone operating in total financial secrecy. You cannot get better at managing money you refuse to discuss with anyone, including, sometimes, yourself. There is an entire layer of financial literacy that only gets built through conversation. Learning what a fair rate actually looks like. Learning which questions to ask an advisor. Learning that a specific fee is unusually high or that a specific opportunity is unusually good. None of that knowledge exists in isolation. It gets passed between people who are willing to say real numbers out loud to each other. A woman who never participates in that exchange is left guessing, forever recalculating from scratch what everyone else learned years ago simply by talking. So, where does that leave things? The moment a woman stops talking about her money is often framed as a moment of humility or privacy. And sometimes it genuinely is. But look closer, and you will often find something else underneath it. Fear of assumption. Fear of exposure. Fear of becoming the topic of a conversation she never agreed to be part of. That fear is valid. It comes from a world that has never quite figured out how to let women be financially successful without turning it into a spectacle, a suspicion, or a scandal. But the moment she starts talking again, carefully on her own terms, something does change. Not because the money itself is different, because her relationship to it is. She stops managing the outside world's comfort and starts managing her actual life. She stops shrinking a version of herself to keep the room calm. And whether that conversation happens with one person or 100, the effect is the same. Ownership requires language. And a woman who finally has the language for her own financial reality is a woman who has stopped negotiating her worth down just to make everyone else feel okay about it. That is the real story hiding behind every folder full of paid-off deeds and quiet retirement accounts. It was never really about the money at all. It was about who gets to know the truth and what it costs a woman to keep deciding, year after year, that the truth is safer left unsaid.